Imagine descending to the bottom of a lake and finding yourself face to face with the walls of a church that has been submerged for decades. The bells still in place, the stone walls covered in algae, and the absolute silence of the lake bottom replacing the chants that once resonated between those walls. This is not a scene from a horror film or science fiction. It is something that has occurred in Mexico, in more than one place, and continues to happen every time nature decides to lower the water level enough to reveal what progress tried to bury forever. Mexico hides beneath its dams and reservoirs a historical heritage of incalculable value. Entire communities, colonial temples, and relics from centuries past that the water covered in the name of development, and that today divers and archaeologists are rediscovering with astonishment. Leave your like, subscribe, and share. Let us begin. To understand why there are submerged churches in Mexico, one must understand what happened during the 20th century with the massive construction of hydroelectric dams throughout the country. For decades, the Mexican government promoted an ambitious infrastructure program that sought to generate electricity to supply a growing population and an expanding industry. These dams needed enormous reservoirs, and those reservoirs needed to flood land, a lot of land. And that land was not empty. It was inhabited by communities that had been living in those valleys for centuries, communities that had their homes, their markets, their cemeteries, and their churches. When the eviction order arrived, families had to collect what they could carry and leave, leaving behind everything they could not take with them. The houses, temples, monuments, and plazas remained underwater, preserved in a state of indefinite suspension between the past and the present, waiting for the moment when some severe drought or unusual drop in the reservoir level would bring them back to the surface. The parish of San Pedro Apostol in Churumuco in the state of Michoacan is perhaps the best known and most emotionally resonant example of this phenomenon in Mexico. This church was built in the year 1800 and for more than a century and a half was the spiritual heart of the community of Churumuco, a town that lived from agriculture and fishing on the banks of the Balsas River. But beyond its architectural or religious importance to the local community, this parish has a historical connection with one of the most important figures in the history of Mexico, Father José María Morelos y Pavón, who would become one of the most brilliant and influential leaders of the Mexican War of Independence, celebrated masses in this church. Morelos was in Churumuco, walked its streets, preached within its walls, and left in that place a historical imprint that no amount of water can completely erase. In 1965, when the El Infiernillo Dam was built on the Balsas River, the town of Churumuco and its historic parish were submerged under the waters of the new reservoir. Families were relocated, the most valuable and portable objects were rescued, but the structure itself of the church, its stone walls, its arches, its tower, and its bells, remained at the bottom of the artificial lake that formed as the water rose. For years, the church existed only in the memory of the displaced and in old photographs. But nature has its own agenda, and the periodic droughts that affect Michoacan have caused significant drops in the dam level, moments when the parish reappears partially or totally above the water surface, emerging as a ghost from the past that refuses to be forgotten. When divers and photographers have been able to document the church during periods when it is still partially submerged but accessible for diving, the images they have obtained are of a disturbing beauty. The stone walls remain standing after more than half a century underwater, which speaks to the quality of colonial construction. The arches remain intact. The general structure of the building is recognizable to anyone who has seen photographs of the town before its flooding. Water has transformed the interior into its own ecosystem, with aquatic life that has colonized every surface. But the underlying architecture remains as a testament to the skill of the builders of the early 19th century and as an involuntary monument to a community that was sacrificed in the name of progress. The connection of this place with Morelos grants it a historical dimension that goes beyond the local. Morelos was an extraordinary figure, a priest of humble origin who became a military strategist, a legislator, and a symbol of the struggle for independence and social equality in Mexico. He was captured by the Spanish in 1815 and executed that same year. But his legacy endured and his figure is today venerated throughout the country. The fact that he preached in the parish of Churumuco makes that submerged temple a site of national historical importance, a place that would deserve protection and rigorous study if circumstances allowed. Leave your like, subscribe, and share. But Churumuco is not the only case. Mexico has a collection of submerged churches and temples that form a unique underwater heritage in the world. and each of them has its own story of displaced communities, of government decisions that prioritized electricity over memory, and of structures that have resisted the passage of time and the weight of water with an almost superhuman stubbornness. In the state of Guanajuato, in the center of the country, there is another equally fascinating case. The Temple of La Purísima, belonging to the old town of Jalpa, reappears during droughts in the La Purísima Dam. This temple, like that of Churumuco, was flooded when the reservoir that carries the same name as the religious building was built, an irony that has not gone unnoticed by the inhabitants of the region. The old town of Jalpa was a community with centuries of history in the Baixio region of Guanajuato, an area that since the colonial period was one of the most prosperous and culturally rich centers of New Spain. The temples of the Baixio are famous for their elaborate Baroque architecture, for their facades decorated with a profusion of ornaments that reflect the mineral wealth of the region and the skill of the indigenous artisans who worked under the direction of the evangelizing friars. When the Temple of La Purísima of Jalpa disappears underwater, not only does an architectural structure disappear, a piece of a cultural and historical puzzle disappears that defines the identity of an entire region. And when it reappears even briefly during a drought that lowers the reservoir level, the inhabitants of nearby towns come to see it as if it were a miracle, as if the temple itself were reminding them that it existed, that the community that built it existed, and that that memory deserves to be preserved. The third case is perhaps the most spectacular from a visual and geographical standpoint. In the state of Chiapas, in southern Mexico, the Netzahualcoyotl Dam created an enormous reservoir that submerged the old town of Cochula along with its colonial church, known as the Temple of Cochula. This temple is particularly impressive because its dimensions are extraordinary for a construction of its era. It was built by Dominican friars during the colonial period, probably in the 16th century, making it one of the oldest buildings among those lying beneath the waters of Mexican dams. Its size and the solidity of its construction have guaranteed that it remains standing decades after being submerged, and when the level of the Netzahualcoyotl Dam lake drops enough, the temple emerges spectacularly, with its walls several meters high protruding from the water like the ruins of a lost civilization. The images of the Temple of Cochula emerging from the lake have become some of the most shared and commented photographs of Mexico on social media and international media. There is something deeply evocative in the vision of those imposing walls surrounded by the reservoir water, with the mountains of Chiapas in the background and the tropical sky above them. It is an image that condenses in a single frame centuries of history, the ambition of the colonial friars who built that monumental building in the middle of the jungle, the life of the indigenous communities that converted to Christianity in its naves, the progress of the 20th century that buried it underwater, and the persistence of historical memory that refuses to disappear. When the water level drops enough, divers have been able to explore the interior of the Cochula temple and document its state of conservation. What they have found is surprising. Despite decades underwater, the basic structure of the building remains in good condition. The walls, built with the colonial technique of stone and lime masonry, have resisted the pressure and erosion of the water better than many expected. The interior is covered by layers of sediment and colonized by various forms of aquatic life, but the architectural floor plan of the temple is clearly recognizable, and in some areas, decorative details can still be appreciated that speak of the care and skill with which it was built more than 4 centuries ago. What these three cases have in common, beyond the obvious similarity of being churches submerged by hydroelectric dams, is that they all represent a fundamental tension that Mexico and many other countries have faced during the 20th century, the tension between economic development and the preservation of cultural and historical heritage. The El Infiernillo, La Purísima, and Netzahualcoyotl dams generated electricity that was real and necessary for millions of people. That benefit cannot be ignored, but the cost of that benefit was paid disproportionately by the communities that were displaced, that lost their homes, their lands, their temples, and their cemeteries, and who in many cases were relocated in deficient conditions with very little compensation for what they lost. Today, decades after those floodings, when divers and archaeologists descend to explore those submerged churches, they are not just engaging in tourism or adventure, they are performing an act of rescue of historical memory. They are documenting, photographing, and analyzing structures that represent centuries of colonial, indigenous, and republican history of Mexico, structures that would otherwise remain completely invisible and inaccessible. And when those documents, those photographs, and those videos reach the public, they generate something important. They generate awareness that beneath the calm waters of an artificial lake, there can be a complete world waiting to be rediscovered. A world that belongs to everyone because it forms part of the collective heritage of a nation. The submerged churches of Mexico are ultimately a reminder that history does not disappear just because we cover it with water. The walls of the parish of San Pedro Apostol in Churumuco, where Morelos preached, continue to stand after more than half a century of immersion. The Temple of La Purísima of Jalpa continues to emerge during droughts as if reclaiming its place on the surface. The monumental Temple of Cochula in Chiapas continues to impress all who see it rise from the lake with its enormous intact colonial walls. These structures have survived time, earthquakes, decades underwater, and the indifference of those who condemn them to flooding. And they will continue to survive because they are built with the same solidity with which the best memories are built, with materials that resist, with a presence that cannot be completely erased, and with a history that always finds its way back to the surface. Leave your like, subscribe, and share. Until next time.